Nobody is saying that chapter 7 of Daniel is easy, but as always, the scripture writers give us some clues in their texts because they want us to understand it. And it's there in plain sight in verse 1, which says, "In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream, and visions passed through his mind as he was lying in bed." That is all we need to know in order to understand and get to grips with this passage. The ancient world lived in a very spiritual universe. They didn't do anything without consulting the spiritual forces. They wouldn't plant a vegetable patch without seeking the gods, whichever god they followed. They wouldn't go on a journey without making an offering to the gods. They wouldn't make any decisions without consulting the gods. They would throw lots. They had all kinds of means to find what was the best decision, and they were constantly seeking to know what the future was. And this was especially true of the kings and rulers because they had to be absolutely sure that their decisions were right. I think I've mentioned to you in the past, I had a lovely visit to the British Museum some time ago and saw the exhibition about Ashurbanipal, king of Syria, 100 years before Daniel, and a different empire. But he had a massive library of which he was very proud. And the library was full of stories of the mythology of how the world was created, and also lots of medicinal advice and how to cast spells and how to take different kind of herbs and so on to improve your health, and also how to predict the future. That was great. And he was very proud. Ashurbanipal was very proud of that. Not only that he had a library, but he could read, and that he did read from it. The same was pretty much true, we imagine, of Nebuchadnezzar and his Babylonian empire. He did have a whole department of his government dedicated to finding the future and to advising him in his decisions. We get a sort of sense of this actually from a verse in Ezekiel, where Ezekiel is prophesying about what is going to happen when Nebuchadnezzar and his army approach the Holy Land. Will he go north and attack Jerusalem, or will he go south and attack Egypt? And Ezekiel has this sort of little dreamy verse in which he imagines what might happen. And he says, "For the king of Babylon will stop at the fork in the road, at the junction of the two roads, to seek an omen. He will cast lots with arrows. He will consult the idols, and he will examine the liver." That's Ezekiel 21:21. And we don't know if that actually happened, or if Ezekiel is imagining the kind of thing that was going to happen. But you note that he casts lots with arrows, throws arrows on the ground, see how they fall, consult the gods and see if the gods he's carrying with him say anything. And he would sacrifice an animal, and his experts would look at the liver and see how the liver looked, and the way the liver looked would tell him whether he should go right or left at the fork in the road. Now, that was how kings typically lived their lives. Everything was spiritual. There was a spiritual force behind everything. And there was, of course, another way to know the future, and that was to have a dream about it. And we know that Babylon had a whole department dedicated to analysing dreams and seeing what the dreams were telling you. And we know the name of the head of that department. Of course, it was our Daniel, the dream man. He was a go-to man when you had a dream. And that is how Daniel had risen to fame and to fortune. Now, in the time of Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel seems to have done very well. Now, I know he had a bit of a bad patch at times with the with his friends in the fiery furnace and so on. But by and large, Daniel had been taken to Babylon from Jerusalem and had done very well. He'd been taken at an early age and trained in the courts and the manners of the court and the way that civil service worked, and he'd risen to a high position. He got on quite well, actually, with Nebuchadnezzar. And you see this in a couple of dreams that Daniel had analysed for Nebuchadnezzar. The first one, of course, is his breakthrough moment when he analyses a dream of this huge statue that Nebuchadnezzar sees. And the statue has different layers of gold and iron and so on. But Nebuchadnezzar must have been very pleased when Daniel looks at him and says, "But you, King Nebuchadnezzar, you are the head of gold." That's quite a compliment. And Nebuchadnezzar would have been well pleased with that analysis. But it also shows what Daniel thinks of Nebuchadnezzar. Strange in many ways, because this is the same Nebuchadnezzar whose army destroyed Jerusalem and attacked Jerusalem, and those who didn't die in that attack were carted off in chains to Babylon and made to start a new life in and around Babylon, where actually in the end they did very well. But at first it must have been horrific. But Daniel doesn't seem to hold that against him. And he recognises that actually Nebuchadnezzar's reign, as reigns go, is quite a prosperous one and quite a blessed one. Then there's a second dream that Nebuchadnezzar has, where Nebuchadnezzar is seen as a great big tree in which the nations come and like birds and nest in his tree. And this is, in fact, we know what Nebuchadnezzar did. He brought people from different nations to the kingdom of Babylon and settled them and hoped that they would prosper. And by and large they did, and they did pretty well. In fact, so much so that Jerusalem continued virtually and lived in for decades and decades afterwards, and while the Jews settled down and made their fortune in Babylon and set up a Bible college and everything else. So Daniel sees Nebuchadnezzar as a good force for good in the world, a man who was, despite his many failings, was actually doing good to a lot of people. But something had changed, and that's what verse 1 tells us. Belshazzar had taken over as king of Babylon, and he had pensioned Daniel off. Daniel was sent to live in his retirement cottage and potter in his vegetable patch, and generally shut out of court, while Belshazzar completely ignored Daniel and Daniel's God. And this came to a head, really. Would come to a head at the banquet, where Belshazzar saw words on the wall, and Daniel interpreted them. But Daniel in chapter 5 verse 22 says to him, "This you know, though, but you have not humbled yourself before God. You knew that I had interpreted dreams. You knew that God was here, that there was a real God, but you chose to ignore that." So it's in this vein that Daniel has this vision, and suddenly things have changed. From this comforting vision of the head of gold, of the statue, of the tree which is bringing the nations to settle, suddenly we have this vision of monsters and beasts, and suddenly we're looking at the dark side of the spiritual forces that are behind nations. Daniel knows that there can be good in a nation, but Daniel now tells us actually nations can be terrible, can be demonic in their power. And things have changed, and that's why we've got these frightening visions. If you read the book of Romans, you find the Apostle Paul quite optimistic and quite and very sympathetic to the Roman Empire. It was written in AD 57, and he tells the Romans to settle down and pray for the kingdom and to be good citizens. 7 or 8 years after he wrote that, there was that terrible persecution in Rome by Emperor Nero of the Christians, and tensions rose. And by the time you later on in the century, you get the book of Revelation, or where Rome is seen as a mighty beast and of an agent of evil in the world. Things had flipped on their head, and that's what's happening in chapter 7. And we have all the beasts. Now, look, you want to know what the beasts mean, and you can argue about that. Some people say they're the Babylonian Empire, the Emperor of the Medes, the Emperor of the Persians, and the Emperor of the Greeks. But really, we don't know for sure. We're not supposed to know, I think, to be absolutely sure. It doesn't matter, in fact, what these beasts are. The point is that Daniel is pointing out that at times nations and empires can be overtaken by evil forces, and they can end up doing more harm than good. You get a flavour of this, by the way, in the New Testament. My home group, we've just been studying 2 Thessalonians, where Paul talks about the Antichrist who will come. But you have to balance that with 1 John, where he does talk about the Antichrist, but he says in chapter 2, verse 18, John says, by the way, many antichrists have already come. So in other words, that this idea of evil empires, they go on repeating throughout history. So in a sense, it doesn't matter which physical empire are represented by the beasts. The point is that there is an element of evil that is constantly attacking humanity. And really, I think Daniel is just sort of pinching ideas from the Babylonian spirituality. There's the beast from the sea, Rahab and Leviathan, that he mentions in verse 3. Verse 10, he talks about the tablets of fate, the books, and the Babylonians had tablets of fate that they would consult about what was happening in the world. They had an annual festival in Babylon about fight between the gods. And Daniel steals those ideas and talks about the empires being demonic gods who are fighting each other, and each one can be worse than the other. So that's what's happening. That's what we're looking at. We're looking at the evil behind the world. But Daniel says, look, it isn't a constant. It isn't just about them. There is another force in the world, which is the force of God, and that is the force that is going to eventually conquer and overcome. He says in verse 9, I looked and thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was as white as snow, and so he goes on about rivers of fire flowing and thousands attending him, and the book's been opened. And he realizes that, actually the one in control is the Ancient of Days, and that's God. And no matter how bad things look, and at the time in the first years in the beginning of Belshazzar, things looked grim. As a matter of fact, things improved considerably later, and in the end, it ended up in the restoration of the temple and in the restoration of Jerusalem. But that was decades ahead of the moment that Daniel is living in. But he says, look, there is an Ancient of Days. God is eternal, and God is eternally good. So don't panic. And then he goes on to make what is one of the most dramatic declarations in the whole of the Old Testament. And you may well have overlooked it as we read through the passage earlier. You might not have noticed its significance, but it's there. And that's what makes Daniel one of the most important books of the Old Testament. Because he goes on to talk about the Son of Man, who coming with the clouds of heaven, and he's given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and people of every language worship him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. And you want to know that? Well, you know who that is. That is a clear reference to the coming of Jesus Christ and his everlasting kingdom. It's a clear recognition that God is going to intervene in history, and that intervention began in a stable in Bethlehem, and will continue until the end of the world, until all things are delivered to the hand of Jesus. But in this passage, then goes on to make, in 2 verses, dramatic claims. Do you note he says, the holy people of Most High, this is verse 18, the holy people of the Most High will receive the kingdom and will possess it forever. Yes, forever and ever. The people of God will possess the kingdom. And he repeats that in verse 27, just in case you missed it in verse 18. Then the sovereignty, power and greatness of all the kingdoms under heaven will be handed over to the holy people of the Most High. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom. All rulers will worship and obey him. But who inherits the kingdom? It's the people of God. Is that ringing a bell in your mind? Can you remember reading from Scripture the day when a Galilean preacher called Jesus of Nazareth stood on a hillside and said to his people, "Fear not, little flock, for it has pleased the Father to grant you his kingdom." Yeah, Jesus is referring directly to Daniel 7. You see, Daniel 7 was one of Jesus' favourite chapters. Jesus loved this chapter of the Bible because it made him understand his purpose on earth and his eternal purposes as a member of the Trinity of God. He was destined to rule. And the people he was looking at, and that could have been you and me because he's looking at us now, he's saying to us, fear not. I know the crisis you're passing through. I know the powerful forces that are arrayed. And if you want to look through our modern world, you can look around the nations and see whole nations attacking the people of God. People of God, people, the followers of Jesus, are under terrible persecution. And there's all kinds of things and violence happening in the world. The monsters are tramping over the earth. But we are destined to inherit God's kingdom because we are followers of Jesus. And so Jesus takes this wonderful chapter from the Old Testament, looks at you and me, says, hang on in there, guys, because you and me, we're going to win this battle.